Don't want you to forget that on Thursday, the source assignment is due. So make sure to complete that if you haven't already. Shouldn't be something that takes you long to do, but it is worth some points that you don't want to miss. So make sure to complete that. If you have questions about that, we're running out of time, but certainly I'll be checking email. You can catch me after class if you need to talk to me about that. So don't forget the source assignment. Also, don't forget that on March 9th, that's a week from this coming Monday, so the week after next, is the midterm. So be looking at the study guide. If you have questions, get in contact with me. Let me know what I can do to help you with preparing for that midterm. So whether that's just a simple brief question, you can send me by email. If you want to sit down and we can talk about it more fully, that's certainly a possibility as well. So whatever I can do to help you as you prepare for that. The material for the midterm will cover through today's class. Right? So at the end of today's class is when the cutoff will be. So this material could show up on the midterm. Our focus today is the last part of our look at the 18th century, specifically looking at the practice of Christians. In this respect, thinking about this notion of practice, a lot of our examination over the second half of the course, right, from the 18th century onward, a lot of what we'll be talking about will tend to be new Christian groups. Certainly we will talk about new theologies in the doctrine section, but there won't be a lot of totally new practices. That's most of what we'll be focusing on is ways in which people develop new approaches towards living out their Christianity. Some of which we may or may not accept as Christian. We are, again, using it very broadly. To talk about church history, and so we sometimes have to take a look at some of these groups that we might not agree with, might not even say, well, that's not totally Christian, but are important in the overall development of what we call church history. So here and there we'll be talking about some focused practices. We'll talk about new music styles, for example, maybe new approaches to worship. But most of the focus of practice is going to be new types of movements. And so that's kind of where we are today as we begin looking at the 18th century and practice. What was it Christians did in the 18th century, especially thinking of new changes? So, for example, we're not going to be talking about baptism, although people were baptizing. Certainly, and they were baptizing in different ways. Some by immersion, some by thought they would say they were baptizing through sprinkling and through pouring and those kind of things. People were still participating in communion or the Eucharist. But I want to focus on some new groups or some different groups. One group that kind of draws its inspiration from the Pietist movement of the 17th century is a group known as the Moravians. Now, the name that they start with is the Unitas Fratrum, the unity of the brothers. Moravians is, of course, a name that is applied to them. Moravia was a region near Bohemia, which is today's modern Czech Republic, so Eastern Europe is where we're talking about. It largely grows out of the influence of a man named John Huss, who we talked about at the very, very beginning of the semester. He was a 14th century, 15th century reformer. And so prior to the Reformation, he was doing some work trying to bring about the Reformation of the church. Largely persecuted, Huss himself was executed as a heretic, but some people continued to follow along with his ideas, to shape them, modify them as they continued, and the Moravians are one of those groups. In the 16th century, during the Reformation period, it spread to Poland, largely because of persecution experienced in Bohemia and Moravia, and it continued to grow. Now, the Moravian Church has never been a huge group, but during that 16th century is where it experienced a lot of growth, most of it in response to persecution. And after the 30 Years' War, again, we're talking 16th century now, after the 30 Years' War, where Catholic forces took over Bohemia, there was continued persecution of the brothers as well. It was almost destroyed until they found refuge on the estates of a man named Count Nicholas Zinzendorf. He was the grandson, actually, of Philip Jacob Spener, who is the founder, the father of Pietism. But Zinzendorf himself was a Lutheran. And so he reached out to the Moravians, provided them shelter, refuge, but he also thought to convert them to Lutheranism. It actually kind of went the other way. He ended up being shaped more by the Moravians. Furthermore, it was Zinzendorf who actually kind of encouraged them to get involved in mission work. And the group spread to the West Indies, or the Caribbean, as we now call it, as well as North America. Georgia was one of the first places in North America for Moravians to attempt to evangelize in the 1730s. In the West Indies, in the Caribbean, the focus was on evangelizing slaves. And they did have some success in the Caribbean. Other missions would target Native Americans, other indigenous people like the Inuit in the very north of America. However, the mission work in Georgia ultimately didn't go very well. They weren't very successful. And so the community ended up moving to Pennsylvania, where they have had a presence since then. And out of Pennsylvania, moved to a couple of places. But the sizable place is a community in Pennsylvania. Today, they number about 1 million members worldwide. So again, not a huge group, but one that is another one of these 1700s movements. One area of practice that made them distinct was their focus on the side wound of Christ. Now, the side wound and some of the things they talked about related to the side wound weren't the entirety of Moravian theology. Furthermore, it was a brief period of their theology and practice and isn't something that is major today, but in the 1700s, it was a rather important part for a lot of Moravians. They developed songs that praised the side wound. Now we're talking about the side wound of Christ, right? As he's hanging there on the cross, the soldiers break the legs of the other two around him to make sure they die faster. They come to Jesus, he's already dead. They pierce his side with a spear. So the side wound, this is what we're talking about. And so they wrote songs praising the side wound. Songs expressing the desire to, I'm not making this up, lick the side wound. To recline and find refuge in the side wound. Here's a line from one of these songs. Powerful wounds of Jesus, so moist, so gory, bleed on my heart, so that I may remain brave and like as the wounds. A popular children's song says, little side hole, you are mine. The side wound of Jesus, in what was known as the Litany of the Wounds, was often seen as giving birth to the church or the believer, right? So it kind of takes on some sexual connotations, right? It kind of is some vaginal types of expression, right? Giving birth through the side wound. Again, eventually this would be downplayed, but this is one of the things where, the group here faces a lot of persecution. And so in connecting with Jesus as a persecuted Jesus, they latched onto that image of Jesus' side wound. Won't spend obviously too much time on the Moravians. They're a small group, but one that had a distinct form of practice in the 18th century. Two other groups that we'll focus on here, however, have had a significant impact on church history. The first are the Methodists. Now, why bring up the Moravians thing, other than to kind of, tantalize you with these gory details about the Sidemen? Well, there's that part. But also because the Moravians become very important in the development of Methodism. And it's almost as if, the Moravians, even though these two groups are distinct, if you kind of remove them from the picture, we don't have Methodism like we see it today. Perhaps it ends up being something different. Largely because of their influence on the founder of Methodism, a man named John Wesley. His brother Charles, who is 4 years younger, was also very important as well, but John Wesley is usually identified as the founder of Methodism. Both John and Charles were raised in a very religious family. Their parents had 19 children, only 11 of them survived. And in fact, John and Charles almost died in a fire when John was 6. So there was a lot of things that befell the Wesley family. Samuel Wesley and Susanna Wesley, the mother and father, were very Anglican. Although both of their fathers had been kicked out of the Anglican Church because they had kind of some preference for nonconformity. Right? So they kind of developed these dissenting types of beliefs. Samuel was also an Anglican priest, also a poet as well, and so it's no surprise then that John and Charles kind of pick up from him some things that they become known for. Both of them studied at Oxford, and there at Oxford they kind of start a group which focused on biblical study and worship. So they're studying to be Anglican clergy at Oxford. But they feel like there's not enough spirituality in their studies there, and so they want to have more of this by developing their own kind of private Bible studies and worship together. And so they focused on weekly communion, visiting prisons, spending time together in fellowship. Well, with taking this and really kind of trying to encourage their group spiritually, other people looked down upon them and called them the Holy Club, called them Methodists, because they believed that there was a method here that they should be following. And of course, it's the Methodist name that sticks. Included in this Holy Club was a man named George Whitefield, who we'll talk about more here in a minute. Eventually, John becomes an Anglican priest. And as part of his ministry, he travels to the American colonies, particularly to Georgia. And while on this trip, there's this terrible storm. And during the storm, Wesley becomes very scared, becomes very terrified about it. And he sees, again, on the same ship are this group of Moravians. And the Moravians during the storm are calm. They're peaceful. They have a lot of faith in God. And Wesley looks at that and says, I don't have that. Right? And so he begins to be a little concerned about his salvation. Now here he is. He's going to do mission work. And he's studied to be a minister. Yet he doesn't feel this kind of faith. Ultimately, he's not very successful in Georgia and has to leave Georgia and go back to England. He falls in love with somebody in Georgia. They kind of have a rocky relationship, and so he kind of leaves Georgia to go back to England. But he still has these concerns, these doubts about his salvation. And he writes later about reading Luther's work on Romans. And now as he's reading it, he feels his heart, and this is the words he uses, strangely warmed. Right? So he's kind of this internal experience. And he becomes convinced that, yes, he does have salvation. He travels to Germany to meet with the Moravians again, including Count Zinzendorf, comes back to England, and begins studying those early English reformers. Because he feels like this experience that he's undergone is not something that's encouraged in Anglicanism, and needs to be. That there's kind of this, as long as you conform to the doctrine, you're okay. That's the Anglican, a brief overview of the Anglican mind in the 18th century. Wesley feels like there's nothing there to warm the heart, to connect emotionally. So he becomes convinced that the Anglican Church needs to reform. But unlike some of the other reformers we've talked about, he never leaves the Church of England. He always remains that, and he's buried in his clerical garb as a priest of the Anglican Church, even though Methodism will eventually break away and will be two distinct groups. Eventually, he becomes very more Arminian in thinking about salvation. Now, Wesley still emphasizes that salvation takes place by grace through faith. You can't earn your salvation. You can't do any works to receive your salvation, according to Wesley. But what he becomes Arminian about is he believes that it's open to everybody. Right? God hasn't chosen a certain group of people for salvation. God offers salvation to everyone, for Wesley. Right? He also believes that human beings could lose their salvation. So it wasn't once saved, always saved. He starts preaching about this reform, about his views on salvation, and he starts gaining some followers. In order to kind of foster this growth, again, he's still within the Church of England, he divides them into societies and classes, small groups, in a sense, right, that are going to do the same kind of things that his Holy Club did at Oxford. Right? They're going to meet to study the Bible, to pray together, do some worship, and then they'll gather weekly they'll certainly be participating in congregational Anglican worship, but these little classes and societies to organize them. Wesley will travel frequently throughout England to encourage these Methodists, and it's estimated that he perhaps traveled 200,000 miles during his ministry, kind of going from place to place. But while he sees himself as trying to reform the Church of England, there begin to be tensions between Anglicans and these Methodists. Now, some of these tensions are class tensions. Because a lot of the upper class Anglicans look at these Methodist groups and they are led by common people from the lower classes. They are more democratic in their leadership as opposed to the hierarchical structure of the Church of England. Often preachers that aren't trained, all right, they haven't been ordained, are being used by these Methodist classes. And even though Wesley had kind of seen this as kind of a parallel structure, right? We have the main Church of England and then these Methodist classes within it, the break, of course, begins to happen. One of Wesley's more controversial doctrines was the idea of Christian perfection. Pointing to certain passages that talked about being perfect, striving towards perfection, Wesley believed that human beings could become sinless through what he called a second blessing of the Holy Spirit. Now, this occurred after salvation. So sinlessness was not possible in Wesley's mind prior to salvation. Right? And so you didn't through works become saved here. But after you receive the first blessing of the Spirit in salvation, the Spirit could eventually bring you to full perfection. Also controversial in those early years of Methodism was Wesley's condemnation of the American Revolution. He felt that the revolutionaries were rebelling against a God-ordained king. And so he felt that they were not following Romans 13, for example. But a lot of Anglican priests left when the war started happening, and in the aftermath, obviously. And the Anglican leadership refused to send more priests to help those Anglican Christians in the colonies. And so eventually Wesley will send Methodist leaders to the United States to perform the sacraments. Because even in Anglicanism, there's still that need for priests to perform communion, baptism, other things like that. While John became known for his preaching, Charles was known for his work with hymns. Charles Wesley was the author or translator of 4,000 hymns, many of which are still used in Methodist groups, and many of which have made their way into other groups as well. Songs like "A Charge to Keep I Had," or "And Can It Be That I Should Gain," "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," and "Soldiers of Christ Arise" are perhaps some of the more famous ones that thinking about songs that y'all would probably recognize. The brothers end up dying close to each other within 3 years in the 1780s. And at the time that they died, the church had over 70,000 members and was close to being, legally in England, an independent church. In the 19th century, in the United States especially, Methodism will explode in numbers. So when we come back to the 19th century, we'll talk about how Methodism becomes very prominent in the United States and becomes the leading Protestant denomination in the United States, even though relatively young compared to some of the other ones that would have been in existence at that time. What questions do you have about Methodism? Anything to clarify? Anything to